We're waiting on Bill Payne. Not sure where Bill's at. Sean, is he contacted? Started. Wayne, would you start the meeting, please? Thank you. We're going to call this meeting to order, and Heather, would you mind calling roll?
Yes. Mr. Colby Burks.
I'm here.
Right. Mr. Eric Ferris. He just texted me, said he was having trouble with his sound, but he is here.
He's here. I see him. He's doing sign language.
Oh, I see his face popped up now. Okay, great. Mr. Richard Nelson.
Here.
Dr. Robert Statt.
Here.
And Ms. Carol Wright.
Here.
And then we have another council member with us today as a guest, is Ms. Dora Thomas. Okay.
Well, good to see you. This is probably the last facilitation I'll do for the Finance Committee in a while, hopefully. The nominating committee has come back with recommendation that they'll present at the board meeting on Thursday. I will and so at that point, we should have a vice chair, and then the chair will appoint a person to chair this committee. I would ask any of you who are anxious to be considered, reach out to the chair after the person is appointed. And so that's the first thing I'll say. Another couple of things before I give you the agenda of this meeting and what we're here to do is that the council just received the Diversity Governmental Partnership from the annual Derby Business Summit, and I appreciate people for coming. It just was wonderful at the gathering, so thank you. Please feel free to anything you want to. Colby was there. We also had Luke. So our board members were well represented, as well as a large contingent CMRC staff. I thought it was a wonderful event. And so we're very pleased to be named the governmental partner of the year with the business summit along those lines. Colby, Doris, did you add anything to that?
Congratulations to you for getting it. I think it's the grounds that have been made by the CP in the past so many years.
And I certainly can be in there and appreciate being invited to attend. It was a very interesting place, one that I enjoyed and learning about. So I'll visit there again.
Yeah, I will too. I've been to a lot of awards dinners and gatherings. This was the coolest place I've been to get an award. So I was happy to see both of you there along with Luke.
Thank you.
Today, I won't make my president's stuff long. I'll just say that we're here to tuition and fees, mandatory tuition and fees. You know, for those that don't know, I'll give to you. I think most of you do know that the outset tuition ceilings, and then campuses and their boards can go to that ceiling, under that ceiling. I'm proud to say for the last 2 years, we've had the lowest tuition in, I don't know how long, Bill probably knows, 30 years. What we're proposing to you today comes to you after a lot of discussion, looking at a lot of data, talking with all the presidents. All the presidents know that what we're presenting today, most of them, I think all of them can live with it. That's the way we raise consensus in our world. If you can't agree with it, you can live with it. We are presenting a 2-year tuition parameter, and Bill will go in deep on that. So this ensures that we'll have a tuition that they can budget by over the next 2 years, or at least the ceiling. Once again, many of the campuses will probably come under the ceiling, or they'll be below. But that's what we're doing. For us to set these, as many of you know, are for us to make the recommendation to you. Lots of discussion with a lot of people. If you're interested in all the people I've had discussions with, I'm to tell you, but they full circle, as you all know, legislators, the governor's office, campuses, obviously, been met with a lot of folks. So this doesn't come to you lightly. This comes to you with a lot of consideration, looking at what families can afford, with especially coming out of COVID, understanding markets, but also understanding that what we're proposing fully doesn't cover general fund numbers that campuses probably need. But we did get money in the last cycle. We're very with the governor's office and the legislature for giving us a 2% increase to go to our performance funding. That money now, if it will be fairly soon, based on performance outcomes. So that's what we're going to cover today. So with that in mind, I'll take any questions, but if not, I'll ask for someone to make a motion to approve the minutes from March 23rd.
So moved.
Carol will make the motion.
Carol made the motion. Did I hear somebody
I'll
else?
second it. Richard Nelson.
Richard Nelson, second. Any changes, deletions, discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
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 Any questions over my brief introduction to today's meeting? If not, Bill, I'm on this for you to talk about the coronavirus relief funds and how that leads us to this conversation.
Thank you, President Thompson. And Sean is going to be helping me make this presentation today. Sean, Director of Finance and Budget, for those who are new to the council. Now, this first slide basically shows an overview of what we will be covering today, and it's, of course, aligned very, very much so with the agenda that is in your packet. Number one, Sean is providing an update on federal coronavirus relief funds. Then, as President Thompson said, we will be presenting a tuition and fee recommendation. That is the only action item on the agenda. Next, Sean will then provide an update on where we stand in terms of tuition reciprocity agreements with Indiana, Ohio, and West Virginia. We were hoping to be able to bring action items today with respect to those reciprocity agreements, but some of the folks in the other states are taking a little bit longer than they normally do to agree to the potential changes in those agreements. And then lastly, I'm going to provide an update on the fiscal year 2021-22 performance fund distribution. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sean, and we're going to tackle item number one on the agenda, which is the update on the federal coronavirus relief.
Good afternoon. I can tell you that as soon as the pandemic hit, we were immediately asked, what does this new situation mean financially for our post-secondary campuses? These next few slides will hopefully break down the funds that have been made available to help campuses respond to the pandemic, and then also present some of the costs and foregone revenues that our campuses have experienced up until now. So this timeline here shows the three major pieces of federal legislation that we'll talk about. The first is the CARES Act. It was passed in March of 2020. Then the SRISA Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, which was passed in December of 2020. And then finally, in March, the ARP, American Rescue Plan Act. And then also on this timeline, the CRF Coronavirus Relief Funds, which campuses got their final award amounts this spring. So this is a look at these 4 pots of funding: CARES, SRISA, ARP, and CRF. And it's just for Kentucky's public post-secondary institutions. You'll notice that with the CARES Act, about half of the funding was designated to student grants, those blue bars. These are emergency financial aid grants to students. And the other half, that orange bar, the orange bars, are funds that can be used to cover COVID-related costs and foregone revenues at the institutions. SRISA required that the institutions spend the same amount on student grants as they did under the CARES Act, $54.5 million. But the institutional portion of SRISA was greater than the institutional portion for CARES Act. The American Recovery Plan, that funding is expected to be 50-50 student grants and institutional portion. These allocations are not entirely known at this point. These are just estimates. The $40 million that the governor provided through the coronavirus relief funds, that was for institutions. So in total, $752 million in federal funding, and almost about 40% of that is designated for student grants. All right, CARES and SRISA both use the designation HERF, Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, and GEAR funds, Governor's Emergency Education Relief Funds. HERF went directly to the institutions, whereas GEAR went to the governors. Stands for Governor's Emergency Education Relief. And Governor Beshear designated a portion of the GEAR funds to post-secondary education, and CPE administers that funding. And we'll talk about GEAR in a minute. HERF 1 is the funding that was provided by the CARES Act, and HERF 2 is the SRISA funding. The institutional portion of HERF can be used to reimburse the institutions for costs associated with distance learning, campus health and safety, PPE and COVID testing. It can replace some of the lost revenue that the institutions experience. It can be used to provide refunds on housing, room and board, tuition discounts, and fee waivers too. As I mentioned, GEAR funds went to the governors, and Governor Beshear designated $13.8 million of Kentucky's $43.8 million in GEAR 1 funds to post-secondary education. You can see the breakdown here on the slide. $8.8 million to public universities, $2.5 million to the KCTCS institutions, and then CPE held $1.5 million back and ultimately designated that to mental health initiatives on the campuses. And so CPE is very involved at determining the distribution amounts for the GEAR funds and administering those funds. And then finally, $1 million of that first round of GEAR funds went to the private institutions in Kentucky, the nonprofits. The governor designated $4 million of GEAR 2 funds. There was $19.3 million in GEAR 2 funds for Kentucky to post-secondary education. $3 million is currently being used to fund grants to support summer bridge programs at the institutions. Another $1 million for other initiatives, including college and career academies. We do not expect that there will be any GEAR funds as part of the American Rescue Plan. And here's a look at the estimates we've received. No, this is the Coronavirus Relief Fund. Oh, my fault. I'm a little off here. Coronavirus Relief Fund. In the 2021 regular session, the General Assembly accepted the governor's plan to reduce the general fund at the institutions by $20 million, and then to replace that $20 million with $20 million in federal funds, these coronavirus relief funds. And then on top of that, provided another $20 million. So that first $20 million we call a fund swap, because they swapped the state general fund with federal funds. and then an additional $20 million was provided to the institutions. So very important to note is that the general fund appropriations are restored in the fiscal year 2021-22 budget. And the COVID relief funds can be used to support eligible payroll expenses, distributing medical and protective supplies, a whole host of COVID relief response initiatives. And then here we have the American Rescue Plan estimates. $365 million for the public post-secondary institutions, half of that funding going to student grants, and the other half available to assist the institutions. And the note here at the bottom, the Department of Education has not announced official allocations. So these figures are what we've received from the American Council on Education, and their estimates in the past have been very accurate.
Sean, you should also let them know that this money went to for-profit institutions, private institutions, and so on. So
correct.
You've got two different numbers on the sheet. So that make sure that the committee understands that 300, if you add up all the numbers, I don't think they all add up to 364.6 million.
I think they do add up to 364.6. But you're entirely correct that this presentation is for the vast most part is just limited to the public post-secondary institutions. The private institutions also receive the HERE funding, and they've received federal funds as well.
And Sean, I don't know if you already told the committee members this or not, but those ARP funds are based on American Council on Education estimates. Because as of this past Friday, the Department of Education, Office of Post-Secondary Education had not announced the official allocations that would go to each institution in Kentucky. So those numbers for those ARP funds are just estimates at this point.
Correct.
Yeah, they haven't been distributed yet. I just want to make sure people knew that too. Yes.
Sean, the money for students, what is that to be used for by the students? It says student grants. What does that really mean?
My understanding is that that the funding has to be provided to students, and that the institutions do have a lot of discretion as to how those funds are distributed to students. But it has to be to students. It can't be to the credit of students. And so if a student has a balance on his or her account, my understanding is that the institution can't just credit that account, that the funding has to go to the student. And
well, and what we've heard, Sean, from some of our campus CBOs is that a number of our students use this funding to support transitioning to 100% online education. They might have had technology needs in terms of computer hardware and software. They may have needed to access the internet from some remote location. And obviously they could use the funding to help offset their tuition and fees at the campuses as well. But a number of students also had housing and dining expense needs, daycare because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, Dr. Spad, if you would like to see a comprehensive list, we can certainly provide that. But those are some of the items that the students are using the federal funds to support.
That's fine. But the other question, does the student have to apply for the money, or is it allocated by the university to each student, how is it given to the student?
I don't actually know the answer to that question, although I know the students do have to be enrolled to receive the funding.
Bill, I do know partially the answer to the question, if you let me jump in here.
Sure.
Just say that there's two different pieces of the pots too, because I think we're getting two things mixed up. the first round of funding that they got last time, the students used it any way they saw fit. It had to be given directly to them. Campuses had very little control on how they used that. This next round of funding, it can't be less than that, but the campuses can help direct more about how the students need to do it and, pay off bills, to do some of the things that Bill just mentioned. So I wanted to make sure that people understood those are the two rounds that's in this process. The first round, a check was cut to the students. They did with it whatever they will. And there's really
Okay.
no control over that piece. Sorry, Bill, go ahead.
Well, and I know that the institutions are encouraged by the federal government to target those students that are financially the neediest and those that have extenuating circumstances.
How the universities find that out, I don't know, but other than Pell eligible, for instance.
That's the way that many did look at it. Those that did look at that primarily, I'm not saying everybody did. That was the way they looked at it, Dr. Stad, was the Pell eligibility factor.
Okay.
This next slide is busy, but it's a really good one. I'm very proud of it. We worked with the institutions over several weeks to develop a reporting template on the awards that they received and the costs and foregone revenues that they have either been reimbursed for or expect to be reimbursed for through the end of this fiscal year. So the data is limited to last fiscal year and this fiscal year. The template mirrors what they submit to the federal government for reimbursement. You'll notice that ARP is not on this table, and neither are the student grant portions of the institutional awards. So this chart is intended to be a snapshot of the financial impact of the pandemic. So of course it's almost certainly immediately out of date, but we do the best we can. The green column on this chart shows the total awards of about $278 million that can be used for institutional support. And so that's CARES Act, SARISA, and CRF, coronavirus relief funds, added together, $278 million. The purple column shows eligible costs and foregone revenue. And you see that the total there, $440 million. So system-wide, this is a deficit of $162 million, the column C there. A few institutions, EKU, KSU, WKU, still have a residual available. In other words, their costs and foregone revenues don't exceed their federal award amounts. We've been assured that these campuses fully expect to use all of their federal awards next year. Also keep in mind that these funds can only be accessed once the costs or foregone revenue are incurred. So institutions can't use these funds for something else.
Well, and Sean, let me jump in and say that those costs and foregone revenues are continuing to accumulate as we move forward in time.
Correct.
Hence, back to your admonition that this is a snapshot as of May 5th, 2021.
And then finally, the far right column shows the expenses and foregone revenue identified by campus officials as COVID related, but these costs and foregone revenue amounts are not currently eligible for reimbursement. So in addition to the $162 million in column C, in eligible costs and loss revenue that exceed available funds, there's almost $40 million in ineligible costs and loss revenue that the campuses are dealing with through the current year.
And I'm going to jump in one more quick second, Sean. As Sean indicated, this particular table does not include the ARP Act funding at this time. And that's because the official HERE 3 allocations from the Department of Education have not been announced. But based on the ACE estimates, we believe that'll be somewhere in the neighborhood of an additional $182 million in federal relief funds just for the institutions, does not include the student financial aid portion. But that would be an additional $182 million that would be hopefully able to address some of that $162 million federal awards deficit you see in column C.
And that's all I have on the coronavirus relief funds.
Does anyone have any questions for Sean over the information he's shared with you today, or any comments you would like to make?
I had a quick question. I was curious for what is eligible for those dollars, what the fees and foregone costs that are eligible. Is there a list of those anywhere, or am I missing it on there? I was just curious on how kind of concrete they were. Okay, so for like lost revenue, for example, like I don't know this. I'm trying to say, are they able to point to and say things like, we would have had this many people enrolled if it wasn't for COVID? Or is it very concrete examples and data they must point to, or is it kind of predictive in nature?
I can tell you that the guidelines are constantly being updated, the federal guidelines. And so that's a challenge in coming up with the numbers that we presented today. So
well, and Colby, you hit on probably the most squishy of the various reimbursement categories, especially under the CARES Act. The original guidance under CARES is very broad, and so a lot of institutions, we're trying to get clarification. Well, how do we determine what's eligible in that lost revenue category? And one thing that's been very helpful in terms of me and my staff working with the campus CBOs to develop the reporting templates and to try to make the reporting templates CPE mirror the actual applications for grant funds that they submit to the federal government, is that our campuses have talked to each other during the development of that template and are learning from each other. And, once somebody submits something, as you indicated, Colby, institution may have an enrollment projection that says our enrollment would have been X% higher had it not been for COVID-19. So we want to count that as lost revenue. And they submit that for reimbursement. Once they find out that that is indeed eligible, these conversations that our institutions have been having as part of this process allows other institutions to know, okay, well, then we need to do something similar. Now, with each, as Sean said, with each subsequent act that has come out, Carissa had improved guidelines or expanded guidelines for eligible costs and foregone revenue. So hopefully it's taking them a long time to go ahead and officially announce the ARP funds, and we're hopeful that the guidelines will provide even more clarification with that third round of funding. Any other questions or comments?
Bill, I had a question. You had mentioned that $182 million of the ARP Act funding included in the slide 10. When you add that amount to the, I guess the projected losses by the universities, what's the total? I don't see the column here. I see the total awards at 270, but when you add that $182 million into the projected losses, where does that leave our universities? Is that going to cover it? Are we still going to be behind?
Well, immediately in the aggregate at the system total level in column C, that $162.2 million award deficit will become a $20 million federal award residual. And then as Sean, I'm not sure if Sean said this or not, but because this is a snapshot in time, we've agreed with our campus CBOs to provide quarterly updates. And as we get, later in the year in 2021-22, we may transition monthly update because we want to make sure that every institution submits eligible cost and foregone revenue and accesses, every available dollar that's being provided in each of these 3 rounds of funding through the federal legislation. I don't have an answer for you about how it would affect each individual institution, because we made the decision we only wanted to include officially allocated funding to the institution in this table. And I actually called the Office of Post-Secondary Education up at the Department of Education last Friday morning, and they assured me that sometime this week, they felt like either Tuesday or Wednesday, that the announcements were going to come out with the official allocations. And once we have those official allocations, we will update this table. And under, those federal coronavirus relief funds, those columns to the left, there'll be a 4th column added, which will be the ARP funds. And then, as Sean indicated in column A, that green shaded total awards column will increase by that $182 million. And we'll know the exact awards, the institutional portion. We'll also know the student portion, but this table only includes the funding that's going to institutions to reimburse their costs and foregone revenue. We'll know that for each individual institution, hopefully within the next several days.
Richard, you asked an important question, though, at a couple of levels. Bill gave you the numerical answer. Let me give you the qualitative answer. Good. Because there's a likelihood we'll have a surplus, about 20 million, as Bill said, numerically. But that doesn't mean that is spread out evenly with all the campuses. It depends on what the campus has to be reimbursed for. And number 2, it doesn't mean they can use it on general funds. I mean, to do the general fund piece either. So, and I know you all know this already, so we have to be careful when we just look at the numbers, not think how they apply to the actual running of the institution. And this is where we can get, and we have, by the way, you've heard the conversation where that's been really mixed up a little bit, where we have to spend a lot of time telling people, well, yeah, but they can't spend that money on that, and so on. So I wanted to add that piece to this conversation as we talk about it.
Well, and thank you for that, Thompson. Something else that I'll just throw in looking at the data to this point, it is evident to me and my staff that the comprehensive universities and KCTCS have been receiving proportionately more funding and have proportionately fewer cost and foregone revenue than our 2 research institutions. If you look in column C, UK at over an $80 million federal awards deficit, U of L almost 49 million. I suspect once these ARP funds are officially allocated, deficits will remain for our 2 research campuses because they're receiving proportionately less money. They have proportionately less numbers of Pell eligible students, and yet their costs are higher than they are at the comprehensive institutions and KCTCS. If there are no other questions, let's move on with our tuition and fee recommendation. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Sean. Over the past 6 months, me and my staff have been working with campus officials to identify a number of key issues that we felt should consist tuition setting cycle. There are 6 in total. One of the issues is the level of state funding provided to the institutions for the upcoming academic year. And you may ask, well, why is that, a factor that needs to be considered? And I'll tell you, it's a factor that we consider every year. And that box in the upper right-hand corner on the slide helps to explain why. Consistently in research in the area of higher education finance, reductions of support have been linked to rising college prices at institutions all across the U.S. As cuts in state funding occur, puts pressure on institutional budgets. They still have inflationary cost increases, and so they tend to make up the loss in state revenue with increased tuition and fee revenue. What is happening in terms of state funding in Kentucky? Well, the enacted budget of the Commonwealth between this year and next shows a $60.5 million increase in funding, and that's state general fund appropriations. But much of this increase is not relevant for tuition, and I'm quickly explain why. And the three bullets that have the red bracket to the left around them are the three additional pools of funding that staff does not believe are relevant for tuition. The first, the state budget restores $20 million in general fund that was part of a federal fund swap reduction in the current year. In the aggregate, the governor and the office of the state budget director reduced general fund appropriations to the institutions by $20 million, and they backfilled that $20 million with federal relief funds. So that $20 million for next year, the increase in general fund appropriations is just to restore the institutions and make them whole in terms of that reduction in the current year. So those are not new dollars. The budget also adds $14.9 million to the base budgets in 2021-22 of institutions that earned performance funds in the current year. Well, those performance funds in the current year were in the post-secondary education performance fund. And so the total level of funding did not increase. Those dollars that performance fund last year are now in the base budgets of the institutions for this upcoming year. And so the net effect is zero. So again, those aren't new dollars. A third pool of additional funding provided by the General Assembly and the governor in House Bill 192 is $22.1 million in new funding, which is expected to be offset by an increase in pension cost. Now, these are new dollars, but those additional dollars are expected to be utilized to cover those required pension cost increases. So again, not relevant for this upcoming tuition cycle. Now, highlighted in green font at the bottom of this slide, the budget bill appropriates $17.3 million for performance in the upcoming fiscal year, pending distribution of those funds using the funding models. Now, these are new dollars, and so that $17.3 million is relevant to this decision. And I guess what I'd like to do, and President Thompson may want to chime in as well, but I really want to thank and commend the governor and members of the General Assembly for providing that $22.1 million in additional funding to offset those pension costs, for providing what is essentially a 2% increase in institutional operating funds for our post-secondary institutions in that $17.3 million appropriation to the performance fund. Had those pension costs been implemented with no funding to help offset those costs, that would have put our comprehensive universities and KCTCS institutions under extreme pressure in terms of maintaining balanced budgets. And that $17.3 million added to the performance pool, that's the most significant addition to institutional operating funds since 2008. Because prior to this coming year, our institutions have experienced 11 budget cuts over 13 years. And so we really do appreciate what the governor and the General Assembly have done in terms of the budget for post-secondary education. President Thompson, do you want to make any comments?
Other than I do appreciate that also. And later on, we'll talk about some of the other items that I considered as a way of thinking about tuition beyond this. What I know, we've had a 20% net cut for post-secondary education. For those who are interested in the CPE, we've had a 55% cut. So put it in perspective for us too. Not that that's the conversation today, but so putting 2% back in a performance funding model that you all know is different than the way we used it before. Because before, in 2008, it went to the base of each institution. Now, 2% goes to pure outcome funding for those who perform above the sectors in those metrics that we use. So it's even a different way of thinking about 2% now versus 2% then. But the 20% cut was across the board in the last many years. And so we haven't talked a lot about the cuts. We don't necessarily do that. We talk a lot about strategic investment in higher ed as a direct related correlation to an educated workforce that directly correlates to a high or better economy. And as you all see, we've done a pretty good job, but the numbers came out today. You saw that Kentucky is doing pretty good in the economic area. We had a 59% increase in revenue over last year. We needed the projection, we need about a 1.2% increase over this coming year, and we are doing about a 5+ % increase. So, and we want to contribute that to a good, strong, educated workforce, because you knew in COVID, I'm giving you way too much stuff here now, I know. But in COVID, when those that were on unemployment, 90% of them did not have a post-secondary credential. So I want us to think about a public policy way of thinking about this conversation. It's not just but a way to think about what this means for the citizens of Kentucky. Anyway, Bill, thank you. I'll let you go on with your stuff.
Okay, next slide, Sean.
Actually, Bill, can I ask a question on the performance fund?
Yeah.
That 17.3 million, that gets distributed to the schools. Does that become, I can't remember, does it become part of the base, or does that go back into a fund for next year's performance?
Well, in the past, when there have been distributions from the performance fund, at least in the second year of each biennium, those funds have rolled to the base of the institutions that earn those funds. But as we'll see here in a minute in the update on the performance fund distribution, for the next 3 years, House Senate Bill 135, which amended the performance funding statute, directs that the funding that's in the performance fund will be new dollars coming from the General Assembly, and those funds will be recurring to the performance fund. And so they will not be rolled to the base in any of the next 3 years.
Okay, thank you.
Every year, council staff works with campus CBOs to identify projected increases in fixed and unavoidable cost. This particular table shows the estimated increase in those costs for fiscal year 2021-22, the upcoming fiscal year. As you can see in the middle section of the table, we identified several fixed and unavoidable cost component categories: salaries and personnel, FICA and retirement, maintenance and operation, and financial aid and scholarships. As you can see in column B, we total that up by institution. And as you can see in the box at the bottom of column B, the institutions for this upcoming fiscal year are anticipating $116.7 million in additional fixed and unavoidable cost increases. That's about a 3.2% increase on their total E&G base. By comparison, if you look at the box in the bottom right-hand corner, the 5-year annual growth rate in the higher education price index through 2020 is 2.4% per year over that 5-year period. So that 3.2% estimate is a little bit high, but as I indicated in the agenda item for the tuition and mandatory fee recommendation, this year and next year should really be considered anomalies in terms of fixed and unavoidable cost increases because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, these particular costs that are shown on this table should not include any of the COVID-19 related costs and foregone revenue. We asked the institutions to report that in the template that Sean shared with you earlier. So these are costs over and above the COVID-19 related costs. And these are some of the typical inflationary costs that our campuses face every year. I think it's important to point out in the upper right-hand corner in the box there in red font, if the proposed parameters are approved by the council, the net tuition and fee revenue generated by those parameters for 1 year. If every institution went to the maximum increase, and we don't anticipate that that's going to happen, but if every institution went to the maximum increase for the coming fiscal year, that would only generate $26.8 million. So, and of course, we've already talked about the 17.3 million in performance funds. So those two primary sources of revenue for educating students total about $44 million, which does not come close to covering these fixed cost increases. Any questions? As we said
Bill,
earlier,
I'm sorry, Bill.
Yeah.
Could we go back on the FICA retirement on UK? That number, is the size of that attributable to something in particular?
it is, and Sean may have more of the detail on this, but it was my understanding that in the current year, because of the uncertainty surrounding the pandemic, UK cut back on a lot of their own. Of course, UK has their own retirement system, but they cut back on contributions to that retirement system in the current year. And so next year they're planning to make up for that.
Okay.
They basically cut it in half.
Yeah.
Okay.
They were paying, I want to say 2 to 1. I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong, Eric, but I'm pretty sure I'm close to being correct. But 2 to 1, and because of COVID, they actually took it back to a 1-and-1 because of that, and that's where this shows up.
Okay.
And two other numbers that I'll point out, if you look at the row for Northern Kentucky University, under FICI and retirement, you see a negative 14.7 million. And then over to the other cost column to the right, you see an increase of 20.8 million. It's my understanding, and Sean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but because Northern has made the decision to buy out of the Kentucky retirement system, they're not going to incur the KERS cost in the FICI and retirement column. And that other cost column is debt service to help pay the bond issue to buy out of the KERS system. Is that correct, Sean?
You are correct.
And so that's why I was saying that, this year and next is there's some anomalies going on because of the COVID-19 pandemic. These are not COVID-19 related expenses. They would not be eligible for reimbursement under federal program guidelines. But at UK and at Northern, you've got a couple of numbers that are a little bit out of the ordinary.
Bill,
Thank you.
Bill, as far as the retirement goes, at U of L, they also suspended the retirement contributions, and they're reinstituting some of them. That 188,000 looks low.
Yeah, I would suspect that it is if what you just said occurred, yes. In other words, if they're going to make up next year for what they cut back on this year, I would expect that number to be higher.
Well, when you say make up, I think they're going to reinstitute some of the cuts that they'd made.
Okay.
They're not going to come back and backfill low.
Any other questions about the fixed and unavoidable costs? And again, we include this every year as we have tuition and fee discussions because, anywhere from 2 to 2.4% inflationary cost increases on an annual basis are fairly typical. And the only two sources of revenue available to offset those costs, or the two primary sources of revenue to offset those costs in terms of the expenses for educating students, or tuition and fee revenue and state appropriations. And so if state appropriations are flat, or if there's a reduction in state appropriations, that's what creates that pressure on institutional budgets. And a lot of institutions in other states have gone up on tuition for that reason. But in Kentucky, because of the council adopted tuition and fee ceilings in just about every year over the past 13 years, our campuses have not been able to cover those fixed and unavoidable cost increases, and have had to make up for those differences with increased efficiency or alternative sources of revenue. We mentioned pension costs, and I'll go through this very quickly. Every year since 2012, we've looked at pension costs because beginning in 2013 and through about 2018, there were mandated increases in employer-paid retirement contributions, and those were required by the state as those contribution rates were increased, by 15, 25, and up to 40% increases in some years, and frequently in a lot of those years there was no funding provided by the state to offset those cost increases. And so we factored that into our decision making in terms of tuition and fee setting in those years. But I'm happy to report that this upcoming fiscal year, the comprehensive universities, except for Northern and KCTCS, are going to be moving to a level dollar allocation method for determining those employer-paid retirement contributions. And again, what I was thanking the governor and the General Assembly for just a few minutes ago, the enacted budget appropriates $22.1 million for 5 of our universities and KCTCS to help offset expected increases in pension costs in fiscal year 2021-22. And based on OSBD projections, they believe that $22.1 million will cover 100% of those cost increases next year. So based on that, CPE staff infers that the monetary impact of those rising pension costs next year on participating institutions in those KERS retirement plans should be negligible. Next slide, Sean.
Bill, I just want to point out one thing, and I know we need to push a little bit faster. Point out one thing, that the 100% is covered next year, but then there's a graduated down from that point on in the bill. So the year after that, I think it goes only to 90% coverage. Am I correct on that, Bill and Sean?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Sean has already provided some of this information on the table you saw earlier pertaining to federal coronavirus relief funds. This is some of that same information, but it's shown in graphic form. And as you can see, the green bars on this chart are total awards, and those are the allocated awards. They don't include ARP. So that's total allocated awards shown by the green bars. The purple bars show eligible costs and foregone revenues. And you can see, if you look at UK and U of L, what I was talking about proportionately, they're receiving fewer allocated awards and are experiencing much larger eligible cost and foregone revenue than our comprehensive universities or KCTCS. And that's why I would expect that even when the ARP funds are allocated, you're still going to have large deficits at those two campuses. If you look at the box in the middle, this is just something I threw in there to show you at a 10,000-foot level where we are currently as of May 5th, 2021. Total allocated awards, $278.6 million. Eligible cost and lost revenue, $440.8 million. And of course, these are system totals. And there's that federal awards deficit, $162.2 million. But the unallocated ARP funds that we're hoping to add to Sean's table here in the next several days is going to add an additional $182.4 million to those total allocated awards. Next slide, Sean. I wanted to talk just a few minutes about enrollment trends that have been occurring in Kentucky, and I know most of our council members are very familiar with this. But over the past 7 years, Kentucky institutions and KCTCS institutions have experienced steady enrollment declines. And you can see that in the chart shown to the right. The blue line are the comprehensive university full-time equivalent students. They're down by over 6,400 students, or 11%. The green line is KCTCS FTE students, and they're down by over 11,000 students, or 22%. And for the most part, the red line representing our research campuses has been relatively flat. But there was concern among our council members that this declining enrollment, which is being caused by declining numbers of high school graduates and is being exacerbated by COVID-19. But there's concern that if those enrollment declines continued, that we may not be able to continue making the kind of progress toward our 60% college attainment by 2030 goal. And so in a resolution adopted by the executive committee of the council on March 3rd, council members called on CPE and campus leaders to implement bold strategies and actions to mitigate the near-term enrollment effects of COVID-19. And we believe that we have done that with this parameter that staff is proposing for your consideration today. Next slide, Sean.
Bill, let me add two other factors there that are crucial to the declining enrollment. First of all, we have declining high school people graduating without a doubt, just the number itself. But we also have had a declining college going rate. That's the biggest concern. Our college going rate now is at 50.5%. And that there's no way. We have half of our students graduating from high school not getting any credential. So that's a big worry. Now, there was another bill that was passed, Senator Wise's bill, that we call it the do-over year. Post-secondary, we don't know yet exactly the effect that will have in addition to it. It could be upwards to 10% decline in addition. So there's a lot of big elements that are happening here that we have to consider way beyond just the number of people who are graduating from high school. It's the number of people that's going to go to college. And that's where we are really trying to combat this with the ed continuum and some of the other items that we're talking about. Sorry, Bill, I didn't want to let those two big points go.
No, thank you so much, President Thompson. And Sean, I forgot the most important point. Back up one slide. That last bullet on the bottom of the page. Are you there, Sean? Hello?
I had to step away for 10 seconds. Sorry, do I need to go back one?
Yeah, go back one slide. And of course, the council resolution called for those bold actions and strategies, and CPE staff believes that maintaining affordability for students and families in terms of tuition and fee increases is a strategy for helping to maintain enrollment over the next couple of years. Okay, go ahead, Sean. If you look at this box in the upper right-hand corner, and this is the last key issue that CPE staff and campus CBOs and presidents discussed as part of this tuition setting cycle. But research has found that prior year increases in tuition and fees are often considered by campus administrators and governing boards as they're setting tuition for the upcoming academic year. And I think it's very important that we remember what we did in the current year in terms of the system average tuition and fee increase. And I think, as most council members already know, the increase for the current year was 0.7%, which you can see in the very far right of the graph over on the right side of the page for 2020-21, that 0.7% increase. And that occurred because we had 5 universities that did not increase tuition and fees in the current year. 3 others had increases of between 1% and 2%. And so that was the lowest increase in over 20 years. To put that into some kind of context, over the previous 10 years that the council had been setting tuition and fee ceilings, the average annual increase has been about 4% per year. If the parameters that council staff is proposing today are approved by the council, the average annual increases over the next 2 years at the universities will be 1.5% or less. And I say or less because that 1.5% would be the absolute maximum if every institution went to the maximum in terms of those tuition and fee ceilings. The increase at KCTCS would be 1.4% or less over the next 2 years. So to put that in context, compared to that 4% average annual increase over the previous 10 years, these rates are 2.5 percentage points less each year over the next 2 years. So these are very historically low parameters that we're proposing for the upcoming 2 years. Next slide, Sean. So what are we recommending? Staff is recommending that the Finance Committee approve tuition and fee ceilings for the next 2 years that equate to maximum base rate increases of no more than 3% over 2 years and no more than 2% in any 1 year for the public universities, and maximum base rate increases of no more than $5 per credit hour over 2 years, no more than $3 per credit hour in any 1 year for KCTCS. We are further recommending that the institution be allowed to submit non-resident undergraduate tuition and fees that comply with the council's tuition policy or an existing MOU between the council and an institution, and market competitive rates for graduate and online courses. Next slide, Sean. This next slide shows information that council staff felt like council members should also consider as part of staff's proposal. Staff believes that the proposed parameters strike an appropriate balance between resource needs of our institutions and affordability for Kentucky students and families. We believe that small increases are necessary to help our institutions maintain quality academic programs, address some of those inflationary cost increases that we've already talked about, and to continue to make progress toward our 630 goal. Something important to keep in mind about a 2-year ceiling is that they facilitate strategic planning and budgeting at the institutions, and they make college costs more predictable for students and families because they know what that increase is going to be for the next 2 years. If authorized, the proposed parameters will result in average increases over the next 2 years well below recent historical averages. The increases will have to come in at less than 1.5% increase per year. Next, a top priority for CPE staff and campus leaders this current tuition setting cycle was to keep tuition and fee increases to a minimum, because we know that Kentucky students and families are still struggling financially due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And lastly, and probably most importantly, staff believes that the proposed parameters are responsive to the council resolution calling for bold actions and strategies to mitigate declining enrollment. Now, since this is an action item, I'm going to stop there and see if President Thompson wants to call for a motion.
Yes, I'll call for a motion in a second. Let's say something first. First of all, you all know that when I took over, affordability was one of my top 4 items, and affordability comes in 2 fashions in my mind. One is the perception that you can't afford to go to college or complete it. And the second one is you can't afford to college and complete it. So it's not just about access, it's about completion. And it's also about the idea that for many students that they don't believe in. That's why you've heard me push this FAFSA argument heavily. We leave $40 million on the table every year from the federal government that could help our young people go to college that don't apply. And actually with the new increase in Pell Grants, it's going to be even more than that. And we're down in our FAFSA completion, no matter what I am on TikTok, even though that's working, not me, but everybody, but still a long way to go. I do believe we have to consider our families and students here. And I think our campuses, when I say that, I want to be clear, they do. And so we set the ceiling and they're understanding this. This is, some of our campuses have a better market. I mean, when you think of UK and U of L, they maybe have a bigger market to choose from, right, than our community colleges and our comprehensive. People need to get, I mean, we've got to give our faculty a raise or we're going to lose them to other people who are giving faculty raises. So there's a lot to consider here. And this was not without a lot of consternation, a lot of discussion, and a lot of people really not getting everything that they want in many ways, but I will give our campus presidents really a lot of kudos. They are considering what the families and students are needing also. The other point I'll make, our campuses are giving more to our students in form of institutional aid than all the other aid that's put together in many cases. So many are converting their dollars into need-based programming to help students succeed. So there's a lot of pieces here to consider, but we do believe for this point in time that this is good for the state over the next 2 years and good for our families and students, and our universities and colleges can live with it. Even though many may not love it, I think they have agreed that they could live with it. So we're bringing this proposal to you, and we would ask for a motion for approval and a second, then we'll open it up for discussion.
So
Mr.
moved.
President, I'll make that motion.
Who was that made it?
Eric.
I heard another
Eric?
voice too.
That was Bob Stad. I
Oh, I'm
said I'm
sorry.
so moved, but I'll second it. I don't care.
All right, well, I'll let Heather decide
Excuse
which
me.
ones of you go down on it then. That's open for discussion. We're happy to answer any questions or anything you want to ask.
Actually, Aaron, I'm thinking from some news reports and that sort of thing. Haven't some of, particularly the comprehensives, announced that they weren't raising their tuition again this year? And that there are some programs that have guaranteed tuition for 4 years if they, as the student progresses. Isn't that correct?
The latter one is correct. The first one, I think many of our, I think our community colleges, I'll let them, of course, we've been discussing this for a while. My guess is our community colleges will not be raising their tuition at all. It'll be a zero. Many comprehensives and even a research institution or two won't go over 1 or 1 1/4. So yes, I mean, they've already came out ahead of us. Now, we had to bring this to you all in this special call meeting. As you all know, how cheese is made is really through a lot of one-on-one negotiations and conversations, right? So you're absolutely right, Dr. Stat. Many of our campuses have also did it to put more money in need-based aid, like University of Louisville, as an example. So you're absolutely right. Other conversations.
I know you had a lot of those conversations, or staff did, but I'm with the bulk of them. And I'm just curious, you know, in general, the tone, it sounds like you've indicated everybody wants to keep tuition level, but, you know, was there a general consensus, or where did we go?
In the end, there was a general consensus. Some people wanted more, who would have liked to have had more, but they agreed that they could live with this. The other thing I'll say is that many of our campuses, I'll give EKU as an example, they took 0% the last several years, right? So many are suffering from a boost in revenue that they are now trying to figure out how to give their staff and faculty raises, to be honest with you. So there was a lot of that discussion, and I understand they knew they were between a rock and a hard place. You know, there's a lot of folks that don't know how this stimulus money works. They think the campuses are flushed with a lot of money in that regard. And you all, we've given you a breakdown on that already, so you can see what the truth of those dollars are. But Mr. Ferris, yes, many of our campuses thought that this proposal was a reasonable way to put forth. Several of the campuses would have liked to have had more, but in the end, they all agreed. Does that answer the question?
Dr. Thompson, I have
It does.
couple of thoughts. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. Thank you. I just wanted to answer and say that you know, I think the backs of future students, current students, and families have a harder time bearing additional costs and finding ways of addressing it than our institutions with their excellent ability to do the best they can with the, not nearly as much money as they want, but I appreciate your recommendation. Excuse me, Richard.
No, you're good, Eric.
Richard, you were going to say something, sir?
Yeah, Dr. Thompson, thank you. I want to thank the CPE staff for putting that good report together and the recommendation. Obviously, a lot of hard work and thought went into that. Obviously, we got into a lot of the weeds, and I try to, when I get into the weeds, I try to get my head in the weeds a little bit and look at some of the big picture stuff. So here are just a few thoughts that I have regarding this conversation. One is with enrollment declining in our institutions of higher ed. I'm wondering, it'd be helpful to see offset, or when there's less students, then theoretically there should be less cost involved. I'm not sure if those numbers have been fleshed out. To be in seeing that. Another real big picture as we get above the graph.
Can I answer that one
Yeah,
first
go
before we
ahead.
move on? Because I'll forget. I know you won't forget your second or third question. We do have projections on that. At times, there's fixed costs no matter what, and that's what we gave you. It wouldn't, in many cases, it wouldn't matter if you had 10 students or 1,000,000 students or 1,000 students, because fixed costs end up being fixed costs. So that's what we look at. Where that question matters a lot is when it comes to faculty workload and when it comes to student support, right? And maybe that's where you're going. And many of our faculty are tenured. Many of our faculty are in situations along those lines. What I worry about, and you didn't ask this, and it's probably not even what your question was intended to say, I worry about when we get to that point and we have declining enrollment, we're going to have to cut the things that I think matter more to our students who come, not faculty matters the most, let me just say that, but that student system, that advising, that counseling, that mentoring, that mental health counseling, all of those things matter, and they're the easiest ones to cut. You didn't ask that, but I wanted to throw that in. I'm sorry.
No, not a problem. That's a good point. Point well taken. I think one of the biggest considerations, and Eric alluded to this just a moment ago, are the economic times that we're in. It's unusual economic times. A lot of Kentuckians are unemployed, struggling. And as Kentuckians struggle, I want to see our universities do well, but I'm concerned about the perception that's received amongst the public when we look at increases. And I realize, look, other businesses are increasing. I think we're entering an inflationary period. But I am concerned about how the average Kentuckian views increased costs in higher ed, which gets to the next point. And this is talked about a few about maintaining affordability and that being a priority. I think the message that's sent when we increase tuition, if it's a small amount or a nominal amount, I think there's a perception that, look, higher ed is costly, and it continues to increase. I think a good case can be made for the increases. I'm not disputing that. There are needs, we're competing with other states. We want to attract the best person and put together the best programs. I get that. But I think part of this equation is public perception and sharing the idea that this is affordable. Higher ed is affordable. And Dr. Thompson, to your point earlier, that the socioeconomic group that did the best during the pandemic are those with higher ed degrees. Fantastic point. And that needs to be conveyed as well. Here's the last point I want to share. There was, Dr. Thompson, something that the staff had sent out back in January in the Inside. It was one of the news updates. It was an Inside Higher Ed story about a Harris poll that was conducted. This is back mid-January. And this Harris poll found that 78% of Americans favored some kind of price controls in higher ed. Now, in that same poll, they also found that there was a high number of citizens that favored free education, tuition forgiveness, and other things. But the reality of this burdensome student loan debt I think that's part of this, maybe why some of the enrollment gets into this perception that it's too expensive. If I'm going to go to school, I've got to take out these loans. So I think that there is, Americans see the need for some kind of controls or some way to decrease the burden on kids who want to go to school. So those are just some big pictures, big, way above the weed thoughts that I have and concerns that I have. Again, I think that a strong case can be made for allowing that cap to increase as proposed. These other concerns that I just mentioned, those are real concerns that I have. Again, not to take anything the CPE staff has done, good report, not to undermine anything the universities want to achieve. I want the universities to do well. I want them to get the best professors and put together the best programs. My inclination is just that this is a really tough time for all of us. And I'm reluctant to even favor that cap. That's just, I'm speaking from the heart, guys, y'all, just sharing, being very transparent with y'all. But those are my
I appreciate the transparency. Let me pose a couple of other ways to think about this too. I understand, I mean, many things you say have multiple dynamics to it. It's not as simple as, I mean, I could point out those that get student loans in Kentucky actually get an investment. It's those that get student loan and don't get that credential. That's the huge issue, right? When we think about it.
Yeah.
There is a perception people can't afford to go to college, but that also rises. We look at whether they can, net price, they really can, but they don't believe they can. So then it becomes another issue around how do we give them real information? So communication becomes, I'm just pointing out a couple big policy issues we need to think about when we have this conversation. So it's more than just tuition in my mind, or a lack thereof. But also it's this idea of what affordability is. We have different kinds of colleges and universities in the state. How we think about public education policy around, I'll use KCTCS as an example. Here's an institution that will not raise their tuition and it's the lowest cost, but how do we help students to understand that, right? How do we talk about working with K-12 to put on maybe the senior transcript of a student at the beginning of the year that says, you know what, you're already accepted in the college at X 1, 2, 3, 4 colleges or whatever. So they know that they're college material. So I think there's many items here. So not that I disagree with her premise, I'm just saying it's hard to put all that on one item, right? As a way, because there's multi-dimensional pieces that go into what we know is when you look at the perception of affordability is as big or bigger than whether someone can go. However, I'm cautious to say that I'm disagreeing with you on some of the points that you're making at all. I'm just saying that if there's many students that can afford to go, and we've got to be cognizant of that, but we also have to be cognizant of what do we do? The tuition that we're asking for is way below the inflationary percent even. So, I mean, there's an element where there is sounds crazy, I know me saying this, there is a reduced cost of operation even in what we're proposing as far as the percentage goes. But I do understand your point. I just wanted to point out some other things as a council we need to be thinking about.
Yeah. Dr.
President
Thompson.
Thompson, could I jump in?
Bill, let me let Richard, he say what he has to say.
Okay.
And then I'll call on you if that's okay.
Well, just a thought, and I appreciate that. And I know this is we all want, there's a lot of dynamics, a lot of things to consider. And we all want the universities to succeed. And big picture, putting the universities as part of our culture, part of Kentucky. There are other dynamics outside of the university system that I'm just putting out there for us to consider. But one thing, so Dr. Thompson, when things get tight, if you lose your job or go on unemployment, which a lot of Kentuckians suffered last year, many have lost businesses. And so they've had to redo their budgets. Some have had to cut back. Some have had to sell things. I'm not suggesting that for the universities, but I'm just wondering if that is a possibility to tighten the budget belt, so to speak. I don't know if that's an option or if that's been looked at.
Well, not only has it been looked at, Bill, we should provide these folks with the data. Once again, I have to tell you, since 2008, we've taken 20% cut. Only way we could do that, and we haven't raised to even come close to matching that. The only way to do that was tightening the belt, but we have those numbers that we can share with you too. But to answer a up-to-date answer, yes, many of these institutions are doing exactly that now to make up with what our University of Louisville, Bob, as an example, or University of Kentucky, or some of those who cut back on retirement in the process. So you're absolutely right, but we're doing that now too, by the way. So not just saying that even CPE, our budget, as you all know, we've reformulated the way we took everything back in and said, we're going to concentrate heavily on this P20 continuum as well as this workforce piece, something CPE has never done before. And we got no extra money to do that other than the grant dollars we can pull in. But I think you're right. I think we have to consider, I'm going to take what you said and I'll stop here just to move on with time. We have to take what you consider and say, how do we innovate for the future by looking at our existing resources? That's the way I heard your question. And I think that's a good way of shaping this, because it's not just about cutting. It's about taking your money and innovating for where we need to go. At least that's the way I see it. Bill, I'm sorry.
No problem. I was just going to remind the committee that we did provide some data under the heading of other policy relevant data at our last finance committee, which doesn't lend the concern, Richard. We have those same concerns that, believe me, and that's why President Thompson said we struggle every tuition cycle trying to maintain that balance between resource needs of the institutions and affordability for Kentucky students and families. But because of the council actions, and particularly since President Thompson has been on board focusing on maintaining affordability in Kentucky, student loan debt. At the last finance committee meeting, we presented data that showed it's been relatively flat for the last 3 years for which there are data, which is really good news. So that student loan debt has not increased for 3 years. And Kentucky student loan debt is the lowest in our 8-state region. So the surrounding states, other than one state, all have higher average student loan debt than Kentucky. Additional information we presented at the last finance committee meeting, the net price in the comprehensive university sector and KCTCS sectors has remained flat for a number of years. And what that means is student financial aid per student has been increasing at a rate faster than tuition and fees have been increasing. And I commend our institutions over the past 5 or 6 years, student financial aid per student has actually gone up by a very large percentage at our institutions. So I just wanted to make those points. And like I said, it does not lessen the concern. We're all very concerned about affordability. But because of the tuition and fee ceilings that the council has been adopting for the past 10 or 11 years, and President Thompson's focus on affordability, while he was VP of Academic Affairs here at the council, and since he's been president, we're actually doing fairly well, relatively speaking.
Actually, can I jump in with a little bit of just university issues? And that is, you mentioned getting good faculty, that sort of thing. We try our best, but right now the Kentucky universities, the salary is in the lowest quartile of the national average. We are in the bottom group as far as faculty salaries go. Another point to Bill's comment was that about 30% of the tuition right now goes back into student support or student finance issues. So all the tuition doesn't go to pay salaries, that sort of thing. A lot of it does go back to help the students. And finally, as far as cutting costs at the universities, whether we have 19 or 20 students in a class. If we had 20, we dropped 5%, we're down to 19. It still takes exactly the same amount of money to teach those 19 as it did the 20. So just some comments from the university's perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Stat. Colby, you're being the student representative. I know we probably want to take a vote soon, but I do think we should have you. This has always been the case when we do these things, is have the student say something. So.
I'm just kind of sitting back and listening and taking it all in. I mean, affordability is a really important aspect of it. And I think that a lot of the burden has been shifted on students in the past few years. I know that universities, it's been tough to find the money in all different aspects, but I do fear that we're moving into a certain situation now where universities have used up the different aspects to shift the costs, and there are only going to be one option left, is going to be to shift it more towards students. So I hope that with this past budgetary year and the money put into higher education, that's going to be that mark that we can point to in 10 years that stopped this kind of downhill flow towards unattainability as far as costs go. Other than that, I'm just sitting back and listening and taking it all in and developing some thoughts, I guess. So.
Thank you, sir. And it is important, I'll say this, and if anyone else wants to say something, please do so, but I'll call for a question. You know, the money we got this past year, or this budget cycle, is surely helping. Now, some institutions got zero of this money, by the way, and Bill probably is going to talk about that in a second. So not everything is equal. I'll just say that as we look at things. I do worry about, since 1999, we've shifted state support from 70% to 29%. And so that means that this was shifted heavily towards students and their families. And so Richard and Colby, you better believe I know that very well. I got 3 kids in college, and I know what that means. And I pay, you know, in that regard. And thank God, God that they're getting scholarships. Any other statement anyone wants to make before we call for questions?
Dr. Thompson, one last question. I'm not sure if you or Bill or Sean can answer this. Are we expecting, is there a possibility of any more federal money coming to help higher ed? Is there any more discussion of that?
Other than this last round that's been talked about that yet to be distributed, no. And I'm anxious even with that, how much of that I wish there was a little less parameter. I mean, that could be used more openly, generally, yes. Now, I don't know where the community college funding is going, Richard. That's maybe where you're talking about. I don't know where that's going. So there's still conversations in that area. They raised the Pell Grants by $400, I think. So, but the other pot that I've heard that could be a possibility if they push more of the free community college piece. That's the only other thing I've heard.
Okay, thank you.
Bill, have you?
Yeah, I would just add, President Thompson, that we had a member from SHIO at our last president's meeting, and SHIO has been lobbying very hard up in DC for all of our institutions, because since 2008, one way that campuses have coped with reductions in state support and limited amount of tuition and fee increases is by deferring maintenance and operation of campus facilities. And as part of this next infrastructure bill that President Biden and Congress are currently debating, we want to make sure that higher education has a seat at the table. And, you know, we've talked ad nauseum over the past 3 biennia, every time we have a biennial budget request. Kentucky has over a $7 billion need for asset preservation on our campuses just to bring our facilities up to the industry standard. And so there's some hope that as part of a very large infrastructure bill that might be coming down the pike, that there might be some funding to help, you know, public universities and KCTCS adhere to some of those asset preservation.
3 in favor, 2 against.
Oh, that's right. Doris is not voting. I'm sorry.
Correct.
3 in favor, 2 against. Okay. Well, thank you, folks. This goes, as you all know, to the full board as a recommendation from this committee. You know, it's always hard to bring tuition forth, period. You know, now I don't know, I'll give you a warning. I don't know if the presidents or other folks will want to come and talk to this group or the board or not. In the past, they have. If they do, I'm not sure what, they probably wouldn't be arguing for 0 tuition would be my guess if they did, for a higher rate than what we've approved. So I'll give you that as a heads up. Bill, you want to go to the next couple? We have a few minutes left. Can you go through the next ones fairly fast?
Yeah, Sean, go ahead and put the PowerPoint back up. The next item on the agenda is just an update on the tuition reciprocity agreements. And then after that, an update on the performance funding distribution.
I can move through the tuition reciprocity update pretty quickly. As Bill mentioned, we are still working with our partners in Indiana, Ohio, and West Virginia on these agreements. We had hoped that they would be ready for your endorsement today, but it will have to be at the next Finance Committee meeting. Only minor changes have been requested from Kentucky, and we can go over these with you, and we don't expect any major changes from the other states. As you probably know, reciprocity agreements are agreements between states and post-secondary institutions to enroll residents from neighboring counties in the other state at the resident rate. So all of these Indiana, Ohio, and West Virginia agreements expire at the end of this fiscal year, so at the end of June. And so it's very timely that we get them renewed for the upcoming period. The Indiana agreement, we have just a couple of changes that have been requested. KCTCS asked that Elizabethtown Community and Technical College be added to the agreement, and 3 Indiana counties be added. The counties closest to Meade County, Crawford, Harrison, and Perry. Elizabethtown has a new program that works in partnership with Meade County Schools, and so they're hopeful that they'll be very convenient for folks that live in Indiana that may want to work in the area and might be a real market there for them. A constituent asked that we add Henry County, Kentucky to the list of eligible counties for the IU Southeast portion of the agreement. If you were to look at a map, you would see that Henry County is right there with Oldham County and Trumbull County and Shelby County, and we felt like that change made sense. The new term for the agreement would be July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2025. And the ratio of Kentucky students to Indiana students, for every one Kentucky student, for every one Indiana student that takes advantage of the agreement, there's 1.25 Kentucky students that take advantage of the agreement. So we have a slight migration out, but as I like to remind folks, these are people that live on the borders. These borders are very much regional communities, and that shouldn't be too concerning. In terms of the Kentucky-Ohio agreements, there are actually 3 agreements with the state of Ohio. They have a slightly different take on that. In the first agreement, there's Northern Kentucky University and Gateway and Cincinnati State Technical and Community College, Clark State Community College, and Southern State Community College, and the University of Cincinnati. And in agreement 2, there's Ashland Community and Technical College, Morehead State and Ohio University, and Rio Grande Community College, Shawnee State University, and Southern State Community College. And then in Agreement 3, there's Maysville Community Technical College and Miami University, Hamilton and Middletown campuses, and UC Claremont College. So all of this is in your agenda item. Ohio officials did ask that the reciprocity agreement allow Kentucky residents in the counties covered by the agreement to be eligible for applied bachelor's degree programs at their community colleges. Their community colleges offer applied bachelor's degree programs. We asked our Kentucky institutions that are part of the agreements their thoughts on this, and all were fine with that, but NKU asked that the agreement allow applied bachelor's degree holders to be eligible for bachelor's degree programs at NKU. So just a little give and take, I think positive for everyone. And we have, and in terms of numbers, a little bit more lopsided, 1,600 full-time equivalent students from Kentucky in Ohio, and 1,049 Ohio FTE students in Kentucky. So 1 to 1.6. And then I have an update on the West Virginia agreement. This is involves 4 community and technical colleges, so it's a much smaller agreement. Ashland and Big Sandy in Kentucky, and Marshall and Southern West Virginia in West Virginia. There were about 100 students this past year from West Virginia at our Kentucky institutions. We're still waiting to get word about how many Kentucky students they have in West Virginia, but it should be about 100, and no substantive changes have been requested. Some clarifying remarks about KCTCS online tuition is all, and the new term would just be for the upcoming 2 years. And as I mentioned, there's no action required. This is just an update for the Finance Committee. Are there any questions about the reciprocity agreements?
Sean, Tennessee and all of the other states, they're not up for renewal, correct?
Tennessee has decided that they don't want to be part of a reciprocity agreement with Kentucky. So
really,
the institutions, as you know, the Kentucky institutions have taken other steps to reduce their tuition to be competitive and to draw from those markets. And then also, all of our tuition reciprocity agreements state that if a student starts with a tuition reciprocity situation, that even if the agreement ends, that they get to continue with it. So as long as they're continually enrolled. So that was a number of years ago that Indiana informed us that they would prefer not to be part of it.
Wait, Tennessee,
correct. Forget I said Indiana. It was Tennessee. And then Illinois was just one community college on the Illinois side and one in Kentucky, and they asked to not be a part of the agreement as well. So.
Okay. How does Western feel about that?
WKU about Tennessee?
Yeah.
I think they're coping. I think they found other ways to get students from Tennessee.
Well, let me answer this. I know we're going to have to hurry up from this point forward, Bill. I hope you can finish up in a few minutes. But what we did, Dr. Stat, quickly is for us to get to our 60% attainment, we're going to have to get more out-of-state students to come to Kentucky and stay in Kentucky. Right. So we did an MOU with our campuses that focuses on their mission and grabbing those students that they know they could keep in our state. So our MOU was better than a reciprocity agreement. Tennessee didn't like that much because Tennessee went to a system of scholarships years ago that had an effect on Kentucky. So it slowed down that movement anyway to Kentucky. And so we picked up this MOU agreement and now it's starting to pick back up. So that's part of the conversation.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Sean over this part?
Dr. Thompson, quick question. Sean, did I hear you correctly? Maybe I misheard, but did you say that Tennessee reduced its tuition?
I just said that Tennessee is not does not have a reciprocity agreement with Kentucky at this time.
Right, but I might have misheard. Okay.
Well, they did. They went to a free community college process a few years ago, the Tennessee Promise. And so a lot of folks that used to come over to the Kentucky side for a cheaper tuition, many of them went to that community college. And that was it. I know we didn't have a long time to discuss this earlier, Mr. Nelson, but to me, policies like that really work on affordability. Probably, you know what I mean? Looking at it from that standpoint, that's what Tennessee did. So that pipeline, it didn't dry up, but it slowed down tremendously. And so when we came out with this MOU that our campuses could sign, like at Murray and Western, you know, they started grabbing a few more of those Tennessee kids again.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Bill, sir.
The last item on our agenda is an update on the performance fund distribution for fiscal year 2021-22. And I'll go through this very quickly. On July 30th, 2020, CPE reconvened the Post-Secondary Education Working Group as required by the Performance Funding Statute. And that group was charged to determine if the comprehensive funding models were functioning as expected, to identify any unintended consequences of the model, and recommend any adjustments to those funding models. And I'm not going to go over these next two slides in any detail, but I wanted you to be aware of, you know, what was done at each of those 6 meetings of that working group. You can see the timeline at the top. July 30th was the first meeting. The short session of the General Assembly was January 5th of this year. And so we had to get our recommendations to the General Assembly by December 15th. Go ahead and skip to the one more, Sean. On this slide, you can see the recommended adjustments to the funding models that were made by the working group. That first bullet talks about establishing a general fund floor that would be equal to the current year regular appropriation plus any performance distribution minus debt service and mandated programs. And very importantly, that policymakers should prioritize maintaining that general fund floor over providing new funds to the performance fund. That bullet at the bottom is very important, that the working group recommended that all funding in the future would come from appropriations provided by the General Assembly rather than carving funds out of campus-based budgets and redistributing those funds. So in effect, what was being recommended was a 0% stop loss. Next slide, Sean. There are no stats question earlier will be non-recurring to the institutions that earn those funds, so that those funds will be recurring to the performance fund in subsequent years. So those were the recommended adjustments. In terms of the current status, Senate Bill 135 was introduced to affect those changes in the performance funding statute. It passed the House and Senate with no changes and was signed into law. And it amended the performance funding statute based on work group recommendations. Where we are as of today, CPE staff ran the 2021-22 iteration of the performance funding model for the universities and shared the results with campus CBOs. And those results were finalized on April 9th. And you can see the resulting distribution here in the table over to the right. It shows the entire distribution of that $17.3 million. The beginning base for this year's iteration of the funding model was roughly $890 million. Once we subtract mandated program funding, debt service, and a small school adjustment, about $528 million was run through the public university funding model. These funds were distributed based on each institution's share of total student success outcomes produced and operational support activity. We do have a detailed breakdown of how KCTCS distributed their $3.8 million, and we can provide that to committee members upon request. Just quickly, we wanted to show you that there are incentives for above average performance in this performance funding model. What this table is showing you is the 3-year rolling averages for 2 of our metrics, bachelor's degrees produced and STEM plus H bachelor's degrees produced. And it's comparing in those first 2 columns of numbers, the 2021 iteration of the university funding model to the rolling 3-year average used in the 2020-21 iteration of the funding model. You can see highlighted in blue the sector averages for each of those metrics. So bachelor's degrees on average among the universities increased by 1.6%. STEM plus H bachelor's degrees increased by 2.3%. And the way that an institution increases their share of funding for a given metric is if they beat that sector average in terms of their percent change. And you can see that under the heading of bachelor's degrees, which had a pool size of close to $48 million, UK was above the sector average, Eastern was above the sector average, and Western was above the sector average. And so they increased their share of the distribution from that funding pool. Let's go ahead to the last slide, Sean. There's 11 total metrics, and so we've shown by a check mark in green shading which institutions were above the sector average on a given metric. You can see the student success outcomes metrics listed there on the left, and below those is operational support activity metrics. And the 4 institutions that received the lion's share of the funding in the university funding model this time around were UK, U of L, Northern, and Western. And you can see the reason.
How do we serve people? I care about everybody, but being from Eastern Kentucky, I won't lie. How do we serve our low income students that in many cases aren't getting served as much? How do we create a way of using our dual credit policy to help offset affordability? All of these, I think, whatever the discussions we're having, should raise those big questions that are policy related items that CPE has some control over. And I think it is important for us to also think about how tuition fits in that, how performance funding fits in that, how federal funding fits in that, how any funding fits in it, but also exactly how we think about more than anything else, the way we see ourselves creating a model, or not creating, but helping the model that's being semi-created for us to be more efficient and helping our campuses to be more efficient. So I appreciate the conversation. Is there anything else to bring to this conversation today? Well, we will have a new chair, not me, of this committee next time. That should make everybody happy, right? No. But I do appreciate all that you're doing. I thank you for being here to this meeting. And I'm going to give you back the gift of at least 8 minutes of time. So if there's nothing else, Heather, am I missing anything?
No, I think that's it.
I'll take a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Got a first and
Second.
got a Carol with a second. All in favor, click off your Zoom. I'll see you folks later.
See you. Bye-bye.